Good evening and welcome to this session of digital materialities. As people connect, we'll just introduce Aude de Mézerac-Zanetti, who is our speaker tonight. She's a senior lecturer at the Université of Lille, and her work, as showcased by the paper she's giving tonight, is focusing on religious change under the Tudors. She's published a series of articles and book chapters, both in French and mainly in English, on the matter of liturgical change under the reign, especially of Henry VIII, on the Book of Common Prayers and on and on the historiography of the English Reformation. So, as I'm sure we all completely familiar with now, I'll just ask people to make sure that their microphone switched off during Aude's paper, and as she finishes and during question and answer, obviously you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions to Aude. So Aude, if you're ready.
Thank you very much, Ayan, for your welcome. So I'll just share my screen now. Let's see. So
perfect.
Yes, coming through. Good. All right, so. I hope you will forgive me for a cheeky start to this seminar. Quotation that I'm now showing on the Moodle, on the Zoom. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm okay. Here we go. So a lot of my feeling has to do with the fact that what we say in our services, clergy, congregation together, is what the Church of England formally believes. So in the Latin, we say lex orandi, lex credendi. But effectively, what we mean by this is that we speak out, what we speak out truly reveals our faith. So changes in the liturgy are important. They speak to what we truly believe. So hearing the Latin expression lex orandi, lex credendi at breakfast on a Sunday morning was quite the marmalade dropper. A well-worn late medieval trope, it is, however, rarely summoned in contemporary arguments, be it on Radio 4 Sunday program. Lex orandi, lex credendi describes the relation between worship and the theological content of faith. It means the rule of prayer determines the rule of faith, highlighting that the relationship between these two orders is not unidirectional, and it's not faith informing the liturgy or faith determining the liturgy. It's also, and often, mostly, the other way around. It's the liturgy that determines faith. Rachel Marzalek was criticizing the decision by the Anglican House of Bishops, suggesting that the existing ritual of reaffirmation of baptism could be used to welcome and recognize transgender parishioners. Marzalek's anxiety about the service was based on the idea that new theological teaching on the matter would necessarily follow from new forms of worship, hence her reference to lex orandi, lex credendi. So although this opening anecdote might seem deeply incongruous in a talk about liturgical practice in the reign of Henry VIII, I think it has its uses. First, it is an evocative illustration of the way believers find it necessary to engage with the issues of the day in their ritual practices. In Henry's England, the issue of the day, which required articulation in the liturgy, was the king's new title of supreme head of the church. I can see messages coming through. Is there a problem?
No, I think it's okay. I think one participant had an issue with a sound, but I think she may have disconnected and is reconnecting. Everybody else seems to be fine with the sound.
Thank you. I saw that the message is creeping up and I was wondering if there was a problem. So that's the first reason why this quote has its uses. Secondly, it's a good reminder of the complex relation of any prayer to the contextual reality in which it is uttered. As Edward Muir has argued, prayer both mirrors and shapes reality. A prayer which is unmoored from its immediate political and social environment becomes meaningless. So prayer is part of a broad cultural system. Under the reign of Henry, liturgical texts had to change in response to changes happening in the world of high politics and ecclesiology, the organization of the church. So praying for the Pope as head of the church or affirming papal authority through certain liturgical practices would create a disjunction with the newly declared royal supremacy over the church. Such prayers would not only be meaningless, but in fact, they would be seditious. Thirdly, finally, starting with this particular example, was meant to show that worship may be a locus of experimentation and successfully utilized in favor of change, and not only mobilized to defend the status quo, as we would often perhaps consider the liturgy to be mobilized. So in Henry's reign, the liturgy was harnessed to defend change and to redirect loyalty from the Pope to the King, who now reigned supreme over state and church. Studying the liturgy, finally, is not, in the words of Matthew Chung Salisbury, a staid, pious, and conservative occupation. Here, I join other scholars such as Sarah Hamilton, Helen Gitos, in their efforts to revitalize the field and rescue it, as it were, from the historiographical backwaters of confessional claims to antiquity. Basically, studying the liturgy does not have to be about saying, my church is older than yours. There's a lot more going on in the liturgy than such quarrels. This paper raises the question of what focusing on the liturgy can reveal about the Henrician Reformation. The doctrinal contours of the Henrician Reformation are notoriously difficult to define. The Confessions of Faith, produced in 1536 and called the 10 Articles, in 1537 and called the Bishop's Book, and finally in 1543, the King's Book, were committee-generated texts that incorporated contradictory ideas, and the rapid succession of these texts, 1536, 1537, 1543, generated a high degree of uncertainty. This has led to a variety of interpretations. The Henrician Reformation is considered by Dermot McCulloch as a rag bag of emotional preferences, while Alec Ryrie defines it also quite provocatively as Lutheranism without justification by faith. Whether you can have Lutheranism without justification by faith is another question. So my work has not sought to provide a fresh interpretation of these doctrinal statements. It has instead turned to how the regime's reforms were understood by clergy and laity, with a focus on public prayer and devotional practices. Until I started working on this project, it had been assumed that the liturgy had not changed during the reign of Henry VIII, and that there was no significant changes in religious practice at the parish level. So there's no denying that the theological and doctrinal dimensions of religion. Yet, most people, especially the laity and ordinary people, probably experience religion mainly as a set of actions and gestures performed on a daily, weekly, or occasional basis. As Norman Jones has remarked, most people living through the Reformation did not wonder what should I believe? They wondered, what should I do? So religious change, therefore, came in the guise of change in practice as much and usually long before any shift in belief. Finally, religious change was for some a deeply personal experience of conversion, but for many others, it was a process which was experienced communally and at the as a corporate entity in the parish, as a corporate entity. So focusing on the liturgy has led me to examine the books from which worship was performed. Out of the tens of thousands of service books which were used in the 9,000 parishes of England, a very small number has survived. No more than 300 missals and another 100 or so of other service books. As you can see, these are the books that I have examined for my work. Survival was never random, and hence these books are about as far as we can get from a randomized corpus, but it's all we've got. So never had the alterations to service books been approached as a corpus before, but 450 books later, I think I'll venture to say that there is much to learn from a close examination of the manuscript changes which were carried out by parish priests in response to the official but vague order to remove the Pope and any reference to his authority from service books. So the work of literary scholars such as Virginia Reinberg and Catherine M. Rudy, literary scholars with of the Renaissance, with an interest in the experience of using books, has foregrounded the materiality of books used for prayer. They have both shown convincingly that close analysis of the detail of the page provides insight into the way the readers interact with the written text and how reading and praying was constructed through interaction with the materiality of the page. I think that the alterations to service books lend themselves to similar analyses and perhaps even more obvious ones. So many of these books were corrected or reformed perfunctorily, with the word papa being gently scratched out or lined through from the 30 places in which the term occurred. So how reformed were service books? I'm just showing you a few slides. As you can see, most books were reformed. To what degree were they reformed? So I'm just using the example of the word papa in missals. As you can see, in 45% of the books that were reformed, it was consistently done. So meaning there's a certain degree of, well, enthusiasm would be the wrong word, but commitment to actually really taking the word Pope out of these books. Where did the word Pope occur in the liturgy? In the Missal, you've got about 30 utterances of the word Pope. Some are quite unimportant. For instance, the word Pope in the calendar for the title of saints like Clement, Gregory, Linus. But the more important utterances are the prayers for the Pope, the Good Friday prayer for the Pope. I'll show you this one later, the exultet, the canon of the Mass, and some votive Mass, special Masses for the Pope. The word Pope and his authority is also present in the indulgenced Masses and prayer. So an indulgence is printed in red. Sorry, just show you that. Yes, an indulgence is printed in red and mentions the fact that if you say that if you have this Mass said for your soul or for the soul of someone, it will be immediately effective in shortening the time the soul will spend in purgatory. So here are a few examples. Prayers for the Pope on Good Friday. You can see there's a huge variety of techniques that are used to mark the fact that these prayers need to be skipped. These are references to indulgences. Just letting you take it in. And finally, to papal ornaments, or even the title of Peter of Prince of the Apostles. That formula is taken out of the absolution prayer in a few books. And here you see that the papal tiara is taken out of the first page of the Missal, which is a representation of the Mass of St. Gregory, where you see Christ appearing before St. Gregory as he's saying Mass. It's a perfect embodiment of the doctrine of transubstantiation. So, in this presentation, I will be showing a few examples of alterations, and we'll try to unpick the ways in which this type of evidence can be interpreted and how it sheds new light on the nature of Henry's Reformation. So first, these books reveal the extent to which the royal supremacy was incorporated into the public prayer of the church and the process by which this was achieved. So first, in this example, change was implemented incrementally and with a high degree of attention to the unfolding political circumstances. So let me explain. This is the prayer for the Pope on Good Friday. So here you can see that the word Papa is blotted out and replaced in the margin with the word Metropolitano. Hence, this prayer was turned into a prayer for the Archbishop of Canterbury. The idea that the Pope might be replaced by the Primate of all England was not outlandish in the early months of the gradual break with Rome. Dermot McCulloch has pointed out that in April 1533, so that's a year and a half before the Act of Royal Supremacy, the king had nearly called Cranmer head of our spirituality, but had then thought better of it. Over the course of 1534, Cranmer encountered vigorous opposition when he attempted to visit his province as archbishop. Seemingly impervious to the irony of the situation, the conservative bishops resisted his authority as metropolitan in the name of the royal supremacy, claiming that the primate's title of apostolic legate infringed on the king's prerogative. So Cranmer renounced his title of apostolic legate, and finally, in November 1534, the Act of Supremacy clarified the situation by granting the king the power to visit and redress the church, which he then delegated to 3 lay visitors and to Thomas Cromwell as vicegerent. So as the royal supremacy emerged as an ecclesiological device, the position of the bishops relative to the king became clear. And this change was then duly reflected in the Good Friday prayer by the clerical staff, which used this missal. The first collect for the Pope was entirely crossed out, I think, and as that's the third moment. First, the Pope is taken out, then Metropolitan is added, then the entire collect is taken out. So is the word Metropolitano, and the phrase here, pro rege nostro et postea pro episcopo nostro, is added to the margin, signaling that from henceforth, not only is the prayer for the Pope skipped entirely, but then it must be followed by the prayer for the king, and only afterwards the prayer for the bishop. So it's a very, very significant and clear reflection of the royal supremacy that is being implemented gradually in this missal. If we turn to the same missal, but to the page of the canon of the Mass, you can see that something again, there's a gradual correction, alteration of the liturgy. First, the word Papa Nostro is taken out, and the word Rege Nostro here is added to the canon of the Mass. Sorry, maybe I should explain. This is the canon of Mass. You pray for the Pope, una cum famulo tuo Papa Nostro here, and then his name with an N, et antistite nostro, the bishop, and his name, and finally, pro rege nostro. And here, see, the word rege has been taken out so that it, so that to avoid a repetition once the king was named first. So there's a degree of awareness by the clergy. Just moving on too quickly, sorry. Next, second moment in the Reformation of this alteration of this book. The words Enrico et, I hope you can see this, Anna Regina Nostra are added to the canon of the Mass, with the word Nicola added for the name of the bishop. That allows us to pinpoint the provenance of the bishop of the service book to the diocese of Salisbury. And finally, this to say that then you moved straight to et omnibus orthodoxis. So you see, there's another handwriting here. I'll come back to that other handwriting at the end of the presentation. But what you see happening here is the word Anna for Anne Boleyn is added to the canon of the Mass. This is a very rare utterance. There's a degree of awareness, I think, by the clergy that Anne is in a way connected to the royal supremacy, as her presence in the canon of the Mass is completely novel and very rare. It only occurs in the alterations of two other missals, one of which was used in Westminster Abbey, very close to power. So later, as you can see, the word Anna was then taken out when Anne fell from grace and was executed. So there's this desire to be up to date, which I think really comes through when we look at these missals. In April 1534, Cranmer's circular letter to bishops required that new and very simplified bidding prayers be used in all parish churches, and that the collects for the preservation of the king and queen by name be from henceforth commonly and usually used and said in every cathedral church, religious house, and parish church, in all their high masses throughout all the realm and dominions of the king. And so, not only are the intercessions, the bidding prayers, the very long intercessions, replaced by a very short text entirely focused on the king. Not only that happens, but the priests must now pray for the preservation of the king and queen by name at every single Mass. In several books with a diocese of Hereford provenance, prayers were specially written for Henry in the red here. I've underlined references to Henry in red ink, with references to Anne, which I've underlined in purple on these manuscript alterations, with an explicit reference to the royal supremacy in blue. So this is a special collect, one of the prayers said during Mass, where there's a focus on the king by name, on Anne, and on the royal supremacy. You can see it here, for instance, Enrico VIII, interis ecclesiae anglicanae supremo caput here. So as you can see in the second missal here, the word Anna was also, I think, removed, but seems to have been removed maybe as it was written, since there's a blank, it's followed by a blank in which the word Jane was probably written and then pumised out, erased from the text once Jane probably had died in childbirth. Jane being the third queen, Henry's third queen. So incremental change and the gradual implementation of the liturgy, of the royal supremacy, in the liturgy, is even better illustrated in this splendid manuscript missal. So the priest, we're still talking about these collects for the king and queen. This priest started by copying out a standard version of the Mass for the king, ignoring the order to pray for Anne by name, I might add. So he copied this out. And then later, the beginning of the first collect was rewritten at the bottom of the page, but this time with an explicit reference to the royal supremacy. So he started by implementing the order partially, well, the order to pray for the king, omitting Anne, and then rewrote his prayer to include a reference to the royal supremacy. So far, I have showed you prayers which were read, and in the case of the canon of the Mass and the collects for the king were read sotto voce, so in a low voice. A different set of problems arise with the hymn called the exultet. It was solemnly sung by the deacon during the Easter vigil in an elaborate ritual designed to bless the Paschal candle and to epitomize the light of Christ's resurrection. The hymn closes with a petition for the powers that be, Pope, King, and Bishop, in this order this time. So it's a different order from the canon of the Mass. So in the context of 1534 and 1533, altering the performance of this ritual was a public vindication of the break with Rome. The archconservative Edward Lee, who was Archbishop of York, specified that he had ordered his deacon to leave out the Pope of the Easter Vigil of 1535. In almost all printed books and in many manuscripts, the notation of the hymn is also provided. So reforming the exultet, therefore, entailed practical difficulties. Taking out the word papa or the phrase pater noster papa en meant that the score and the text would be misaligned. So English deacons faced a predicament. How would they sing the new version of the exultet? They could choose from three possibilities: singing the plain chant melody without mentioning the Pope by expanding other words, dropping the entire passage, or replacing the deleted phrase with an alternative text. So in the first example, you can see that the musical notation has been crossed out, suggesting that the entire passage is skipped, glossed over. In the chapel of the College of Westbury upon Trim, a college that was headed by a known evangelical, a proto-Protestant, if you like, the word "Our Father the Pope" was replaced by the word "Most Christian," Christianissimo, to characterize the king this time. And the superfluous notes were scratched out. So there's a real effort to get rid of the Pope by replacing, changing the word so that it fits with the music, although it doesn't fit, it doesn't work entirely. Another example here from the antiphon of the Worcester Cathedral, the entire passage mentioning the Pope and the King was remodeled with attention paid to the performability of the hymn. So here the title of Henry VIII as Supreme Head seemed to have been added, but this passage was later recorrected, and I think that certainly happened under the reign of Mary. More on this in a minute. In the exultet of Richard Sutton's missal here on the left, which may have been used in Macclesfield, the text was amended to read, "Our Father, the King, Supreme Head of the English Church." But as you can see, during the reign of Mary, the amendment, the alteration was removed, corrected again to because it no longer fitted with the restoration of Catholicism in England. So this is a great example of this layering of alterations, turning the page into a palimpsest, reflecting the successive changes in religious policy. So there is evidence in a number of missals that the meaning and implication of the royal supremacy was being grappled with, and I would contend, worked out on the page of the Mass book with incremental change and gradual adjustments. So here are a few examples of the exultet. Secondly, although I have only been able to trace a few cases, there is evidence that these decisions were pondered collectively and that the implementation of the royal supremacy in the liturgy was not the exclusive prerogative of the clergy, but extended to the parish community. So, first example here, I'm going to show you an example of collaboration between priests. Having been ordered to reform their books, it seems that in most parishes, priests were left to their own devices on how to go about making these changes, as evidenced by the diversity of the alterations that I have shown you. Only the orders sent by John Clerk, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, have survived, and they detail exactly what the priests were supposed to take out of each of their service books, ranging much beyond the word papa, to include the replacement of the word papa by rege in the canon of the Mass, as well as the deletion of the phrase Peter, Prince of the Apostles, from the prayers of absolution. So left with little guidance and many questions, it is likely that priests consulted each other and came to make decisions collectively. The case of the Collegiate Church of Lancaster illuminates the interplay between concerted decision-making and individual implementation. So a collegiate church was headed by a dean, assisted by prebendaries and vicars, who were appointed to serve dependent chapels. So here we have a breviary which belonged to the collegiate church and a missal which belonged to one of the dependent chapels. So in the manuscript missal of the chapel of Eschlode, the canon appears to have been rewritten. Papa was entirely scratched out, while uno cum famulo tuo and nostro en were crossed out. In the margin, you can read Henrico, and there seems to be a pen mark indicating that the king was to be moved to the position formerly occupied by the Pope. To me, it looks like first una cum famulo tuo papa was crossed out, and then the word papa was scratched out and replaced with Henrico. The Lancaster breviary, on the other side, was also reformed with care. And in the canon, not only is the Pope taken out, but let the letters A and B appear respectively next to the references to the king and bishop, suggesting an inversion of the traditional order. So the two books were used by priests who knew each other and who may well have had hierarchical relations. It is difficult to imagine that the royal command to deface all service books would not have been discussed by clerical colleagues, especially in the institutional context of a collegiate church. So at Lancaster, the clerical staff, it seems to me, had agreed that it was appropriate to name the king before the bishop, but then the priests implemented the decision with their preferred technique. So we've got ultimately the same result, but with different techniques being used. Finally, I would like to make the case that the performance of the correct liturgy was becoming a shared responsibility, not exclusively held in the hands of the clergy. In June 1535, Thomas Cromwell appointed the justices of the peace, so laymen, usually from the gentry, as watchdogs of the royal supremacy, ordering them to visit all parishes within their jurisdiction and check whether the books had been diligently reformed. So it is quite likely that these JPs were assisted in the proper implementation of the royal supremacy by a priest who might have accompanied them. This is the case in this. It's the case in this example. William Willington and Thomas Holt inspected a church in Oxsholf, Warwickshire, and their clerk copied out the collect for the king. Remember the additional prayer for the king? It was copied out for a priest who had failed to use it in his daily mass. So laymen were being liturgical books were being displayed to laymen in a completely novel way, an unprecedented way. And they had the power to enforce the proper implementation of the royal supremacy in ritual practices. So I think we're looking at something that is completely new at the time. So from this idea derives my second argument, that another argument that books were defaced partly for show. So they were defaced to be shown to the JPs, to lay people. So they function for the historian as they did for the JPs, the justices of the peace, inspecting them as tokens of obedience or badges of loyalty. This is an example of a short text that was added to the end of a missal. It's in Latin, and basically it says, if there is any, if I have forgotten to take out the word Pope somewhere, I still renounce the Pope. As you can see, it's been written twice. I think it's been written perhaps once by the Justice of the Peace, and then copied by the priest as a way of implementing, enforcing the renunciation of the Pope in the book itself. I mean, this is a hypothesis. It was later crossed out, you might ask me, it was later crossed out under the reign of Mary, I would also imagine. This book was then, uncorrected under the reign of Mary. I'd like to come back to the picture I showed you earlier. I've started to wonder whether it could be argued that this alteration was made at least in part by a layman, since the hand is extremely distinctive and purposefully so, and it is also completely unique in the corpus. It does not look like the hand of a priest. It's completely unusual. The words Enrico et Anna Regina Nostra and Nicholas. This handwriting is extremely distinctive, and I've started to wonder if it might have been written into the book by a justice of the peace. Final example. So this is the case of a priest who had repeatedly failed to follow orders, and probably in the context of evidence gathering, people in his parish of Stoke Dry in the county of Rutland pricked up their ears during Holy Week and duly reported to the JPs, Sir Everard Digby and Edward Sapcott, that their parson, William Divers, did prefer the Bishop of Rome upon Good Friday on his oration. So that's the prayer for the Pope on Good Friday that I showed you at the beginning. Before the King's grace, being supreme head in earth under God of this Church of England, and likewise at the hollowing of the Paschal, so the hollowing of the Paschal candle, so this is the exultet on Easter even. So they've noticed that he is praying for the Bishop of Rome before praying for the king. They prefer the Bishop of Rome, and likewise at the Paschal on Easter even. It goes on in a special oration called Pietate tua quesumus Domino. It's very, he also preferred the Bishop of Rome by the name of Domino Episcopus vel Summum Episcopum before the King's grace, and likewise in the collect upon Good Friday and so forth. So clearly at Stoke Dry, where people perhaps among the clerical staff or the educated laity who were cognizant of the changes required by the royal supremacy and capable of calling out their parson on his treasonous prayers by appealing to the king's supremacy. So this shows that the royal supremacy was mobilized by the laity in their quarrel against the parish priest. Performing the right liturgy is presented as a duty which is communal and shared, with the laity standing guard for the proper performance of the royal supremacy the proper mention of the royal supremacy in the performance of the liturgy. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to say maybe a few words on how my approach to the material has evolved. I started out very much a lex orandi, lex credendi believer, and argued that liturgical change entailed by the political doctrine of the royal supremacy reshaped this idea, the royal supremacy, into a religious doctrine, which I called a functional dogma of the church. But approaching this material with an anthropological angle, I've started to think that there's a lot more to religion. There's a lot more to the liturgy than religion. And perhaps the social functions of the liturgy trumped the religious functions of the liturgy. I think the examples that I've tried to show you are good examples of how the liturgy is aligned with the political reality, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If the reality has changed, the liturgy needs to change as well. So I'm not sure it's that confessional, if you like, but I'd like to show you maybe one example of a confessional change, a change that is more confessional, that is more Protestant, if you like. So you've got the double page of the canon of the Mass. You've seen the canon of the Mass several times now, but on the right-hand side, you've got a crucifix. So here on this side, you've got a few mentions of people that the priest would like to remember in his prayers. Really seeing the Mass as this moment of intercession for others, for other people. But here you've got something else entirely. Remember the passion of Christ, but love not so his picture. Worship him not, nor kiss him not. And what's the person who wrote this in this book is referring to the common practice of kissing this crucifixion at the beginning of the canon of the Mass. And so here you've got a beautiful example of a manuscript missal in which you have this illustration which has been badly damaged by repeated kissing on this part of the cross of the illustration. So in this case, someone who's using this missal is really enforcing a policy of a rejection of the worship of images, and has decided no longer, well, is claiming that he is no longer, I think, kissing this picture, which smacks very much of idolatry. This act smacks of idolatry, sorry. Okay, I'm done, sorry. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Aude. That was fascinating. I learned a lot. I've got questions, but I'm sure people in the audience do too. I don't want to sort of bogart the floor. So if you have questions, please unmute yourself and go ahead. We can also just take a moment to
reflect.
To thank you and congratulate you on this massive work that you've carried on these 450 books.
Most of them are entirely boring. You've got you
managed to make them interesting for us. So. Oh, Benedict, you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Aude, for this presentation and all the incredible pictures that you showed us. I just had a technical question. I don't know if I missed it during your presentation, but this layering of alterations, how difficult was it to do it properly? How difficult was it to actually scratch out or erase things like this? And did you need to be a secretary or have a bit of skill to do this?
Thank you, Benedict. I recognize your interest in materiality. Actually, 16th century paper is an excellent quality, and I'd say some of these books are partly printed or written on vellum. And so vellum is actually the perfect material on which you can just scratch things out and rewrite them. It's almost sometimes you might not even notice that something's been scratched out on vellum. So no, I think it's fairly easy, and sometimes things were quite botched. So I think no particular skill was necessary to do this, and mostly it's crossed out with ink or blotted out with big chunks of ink or blobs of ink, as I've shown in some of these images. So no, I think it was fairly easy. What was maybe difficult is sitting down and just doing the 30 or 40 alterations that you needed to do in each of these books.
Thank you.
I had a similar question about the different techniques that were used, but you kind of mentioned that already, like, so the kind of blotting, the crossing, the scratching, and also about the type of not necessarily paper, but paper and other material on which they were either penned or printed. So you said mostly paper or vellum.
Yes, mostly paper and vellum for deluxe. There are a few really deluxe printed editions of the Missal, 1520 by Pinson in London, but mostly printed on paper. But vellum is more common in the manuscripts, the 14th and 15th century manuscripts that are still around under Henry and serving, and then therefore they are being reformed, crossed out. And sometimes you would print the canon of the Mass on vellum, but simply maybe the 2 first pages of the canon.
Okay.
Just detail.
Thank you. There's a question for you in the chat box about a name.
I can see it. I can't see it. Sorry.
You can or you can't? Sorry, I didn't.
I can't.
Oh, you
No,
can't. Okay. I didn't catch very well the name and the place of John Clock, Bishop of Lancaster.
Oh, Bishop of Bath and Wells. John Clark, Bishop of Bath and Wells, nothing to do with Lancaster.
Huh.
I was just saying that there's only one list detailing how books should be reformed or changed, and that was issued for the bishop for the diocese of Bath and Wells, so south west of England. Most priests had to figure it out by themselves, basically.
Julie, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Aude. As usual, I'm a complete fan. This was wonderful. I have a question about the hands. You showed very clear examples about the difference between the hand of a justice of the peace and the other one being the priest. But my question was about, I believe it was slide 29, one of the last ones, where you showed us on the right hand side of the page the hand of the priest, and I was thinking, are there times where sometimes, there can be, the one that goes all the way towards I was thinking, are there times when it's hard to define whose hand it is?
Oh, I have no clue. I have no clue whose hand it is, Julie.
I mean, what status? The status of the person, either justice of a lay or a clergyman. That's what I mean.
Thank you, Julie. You're right. Maybe I wasn't very clear, but no, I'm not capable of saying that this would be the hand of someone rather than somebody else. But it's just that this precise example is so distinctively different. The one that I suspect could be a lay person. It's unique, and I've shown it to people who know more about hands than I do, and they say maybe it could be the hand of somebody who practices the law. It could also be the hand of a nobleman who the nobleman who started writing at the time, because they used to simply use scribes for their writings. but at this point they started writing themselves, but they would create distinctive hands for themselves.
Right. So you can pretty much determine in general the.
No, I can't. No,
No.
I'm just saying that I have this suspicion, this nagging suspicion.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy, for your question. Thank you.
I had another question, if I may, Aude, and I'm really sorry if it's from my lay background of somebody who doesn't really know much about religious history, but I couldn't but be struck by how, in effect, although the changes are not about confession, they're not about implementing a Protestant faith, in my lay understanding of the difference between the core principles of Protestantism in relation to Catholicism. It struck me that by having to decide, by having to interpret what this means in reality, how do you implement that? What does it mean? What do we do with it? There is a discussion. There is the involvement of lay people, and not suddenly, but in effect, on those changes, somewhat performative of an appropriation of the religious matter. Yes. It becomes something that you discuss. It's not just something that is given by the priest and you accept. Mm-hmm. So is there some kind of performative, not so much in the what you say is what you believe, but by having to grapple with that, yes, in a way you're not entering a gray zone of Protestantism, whether you like it or not, whether this is what you think you're doing or not.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Ariane, you are entirely right. Yes. Maybe I didn't insist on this notion of performativity of the act of defacing. I said it was a badge. It's something that you do to show, to be displayed. So there's this idea that it's not just a note to self, if you like, which priests would do in their books. They would do notes to self, like, remember to pray for this person, for instance. They might write things in their books like that. But here you've got something, as you say, quite different. And I think I wouldn't necessarily connect it to the confessional divide, but I'd say it's very much an example of governing by consent in a way, of having people take on board this change, make it their own. I didn't have time to mention the fact that there were oaths that had to be taken to the royal supremacy by priests, but also by lay people, going pretty far down in the social hierarchy. People had to take an oath. So priests to the royal supremacy itself, and ordinary people, lay people, to the succession, meaning the change of succession, getting rid of Catherine of Aragon and the succession of her daughter, and moving on to Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth. So clearly people understood what was going on when they were taking this oath. It's connected to the divorce, to the annulment, and to the royal supremacy. So people took the oath. People then negotiated, I think you're right, yes, negotiated in the parishes how best to implement this novelty. And so when we talk about the public sphere, this is more like your field. When you say that, the public sphere is born in the 16th century, usually we think of Elizabeth. Patrick Collinson has done a lot of work, and others around this idea of, the bond of association, things like that. But in a way, yes, this is the starting point of the expression of consent. So I don't think Henry VIII would have fit right in, I think, with what we call le régime politique l'obligation d'adhérer. C'est quoi? C'est pas fasciste, c'est totalitaire. This idea that it's a totalitarian regime where you don't have simply to say nothing, you have to say yes. You have to approve.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and I think it really ties in really well with what you were saying at the beginning between the relationship between the prayer and reality, which goes in a way both ways. The prayer has to reflect the reality, but to some extent it also shapes the reality.
Yes. One of my students yesterday, and I'm speaking under the supervision of another student that I see here. Thank you for showing up, Françoise. He was like, but how did Henry VIII get people on board with the royal supremacy? We were just starting to discuss the royal supremacy. It was really very, very relevant, a really good question. I told him, I think my argument, you're really helping me here, because my argument is that by prayer, by imposing prayers for the king and supreme head of the church, first the bidding prayers that you say every Sunday in English, and then the actual reforming of the missals, you're moving towards getting people, well, you're forcing people to get on board in a way.
Is there another question?